News.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK.
We're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Good evening, it's 6 o'clock and I'm Miriam Cates. Coming up in the next hour on Dewbs & Co. Catherine Birbalsingh speaks out. In an exclusive interview with GB News, Britain's strictest headmistress tells me why she's written to the Education Secretary, imploring her to U-turn on plans to dumb down British schools. And as bed blocking once again pushes the NHS to the brink of crisis, we'll be asking why Britain has so few hospital beds compared to other European countries. Jake Fahey, the killer of schoolboy Jimmy Mizzen, has been recalled to prison after he boasted about the gruesome murder. The BBC is facing criticism for playing rap music attributed to Fahey in a track that contained shocking lyrics glorifying his crimes. We'll be debating whether drill music is fueling violence among young people. And the clock is ticking for TikTok. From Sunday, the popular Chinese-owned app will be banned in the US as the American government clamps down on what it claims is a national security risk. We'll be asking if Britain should follow suit. And joining me for the next hour, I've got my panel tonight, businessman and former Reform UK co-chair Ben Habib, and Bill Rammell, former Labour MP and Government Minister. But first, the latest news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Miriam, thank you very much and good evening. The top story, Sir Keir Starmer says the UK-Poland treaty would cover all aspects of the threats that we face and the steps that we must take to meet them. This evening, Polish counterpart Donald Tusk also said he hoped for a return rather than Brexit, as he said he discussed the European Union in his talks with Sir Keir Starmer. The pair told reporters they discussed how the countries can combat people smuggling gangs and Russian aggression and also bolstering European security. Sir Keir says Poland and the UK have shared values and shared interests during his visit to Warsaw, adding this will include deepening ties between the two nations' defence industries.
Determined to work more closely together to smash the vile gangs that operate across Europe. And of course, we spent much of our time today focusing on defence and security. As two of Europe's biggest military powers, with our troops serving together, guarding the eastern flank, we share an unbreakable commitment to NATO. And I'm very pleased that we have agreed today to launch negotiations on a new UK-Poland security and defence treaty.
A Nazi-obsessed man who tried to stab an asylum seeker to death has been jailed. Callum Parslow was handed a life sentence and will serve a minimum of 22 years and 8 months in prison after he attacked a man at a hotel in Worcestershire in April last year as a protest against small boat crossings. The 32-year-old has Hitler's signature tattooed on his arm and used a knife worth over £700 he purchased online to attack Nahum Hagos. The victim, who was stabbed in the chest and hand, said it was a miracle that he'd survived. The man who served 14 years in jail for the murder of schoolboy Jimmy Mizzen has been recalled to prison for breaching his licence conditions. Jake Fahey killed Jimmy and in 2008 was sentenced to 14 years behind bars. The 35-year-old was released on licence in June almost 2 years ago, following his 14-year term, but was recalled yesterday morning. Part of the rapper's parole agreement includes being barred from entering the Greenwich Borough of London. However, in music videos found by the Sun newspaper and also watched by his victim's family, Fahey, who goes by the alias 10, was filmed in front of Canary Wharf inside the area. Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy says the BBC should reflect on the decision to showcase the drill rapper who was promoted on their One Extra radio station. GB News spoke to Jimmy's mother.
I think it's absolutely beyond disgraceful. I can't believe that the BBC would do this. Now, I know that at the moment they're saying, well, they didn't know who he was, etc. But there must be ways of looking at these things. You know, perhaps people show their passports with a name or something, but they're making excuses. There's no excuses. They played his music, and you're playing the music of someone who's committed murder.
In other news, TikTok is to be banned in the US from Sunday if it's not sold by its Chinese parent company, the Supreme Court has today ruled. However, President Joe Biden says he won't enforce the ban for the few remaining hours he's in office, leaving it up to President-elect Donald Trump to decide what to do when he enters the White House on Monday. After the Supreme Court ruling, the White House released a statement saying TikTok should remain available to Americans. And Sir Ed Davey has welcomed the government's announcement for a series of local inquiries into the grooming gang scandal. The Home Secretary announced government-backed local reviews in 5 areas yesterday, stopping short of committing to a full-scale national inquiry. A lawyer representing victims told GBNews there may be hundreds of thousands of victims in every town and city across the country. The Liberal Democrats leader said action is needed more quickly.
If we're going to be tough, yeah, let's have the inquiry. Just as you say, you're quite right about that. But I don't think we should let the government get away with not taking the action now. We need to take the action now. And I think that's what Liberal Democrats would urge the government and all opposition parties. And I'm sure you would agree, we do need action now.
And those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'll be back in an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome to Dewbs & Co with me, Miriam Cates. And joining me until 7 o'clock, I've got my panel. Former Labour Armed Forces Minister Bill Rammell and businessman and former Deputy Leader of Reform Ben Habib. As always, we want to hear what you think at home, so please get your views in at gbnews.com/yoursay. Now, Catherine Birbalsingh, often dubbed Britain's strictest headmistress, has today written a public letter to the Education Secretary imploring her not to press ahead with the government's controversial schools bill. Now, here's a quick reminder of some of those more controversial provisions within that bill. Firstly, all schools are going to be compelled to follow the national curriculum, including academies and free schools, which currently are allowed to teach what they want. There are going to be new powers for Education Secretary to give directions to academy leaders. There's going to be no flexibilities for academies to pay specialist teachers more. And schools will only be allowed a maximum of 3 branded uniform items. Now, Catherine joined me earlier for an exclusive interview to explain her concerns. It's extraordinarily successful. You've got quite a deprived intake of children, and yet your results are absolutely astounding. It was really extraordinary that Bridget Phillipson couldn't even bring herself to congratulate you and your school on your latest exam results. Why do you think that is?
I really can't explain it. I don't understand. You know, I suppose maybe she sees us as a free school as a success of the previous government. And so she didn't want to be caught out, recognizing that the previous government had done something good, which is really sad that politics can be so tribal. I think it's so important that the fact is the Conservative government over the last, decade or more, in fact, 14 years, it's done an excellent job for education. And that's something, all the reforms that were brought along before that have really given us all such energy and such enthusiasm in our schools. Why not build on that? And of course, there are issues like recruitment and retention is a huge issue for schools and continues to be. That is something that the Conservative government did not address. And it's something that she could look to address. But actually, with her reforms on taking away academies' freedom around pay, it's quite likely going to cost teachers massively in terms of their salaries. She's making it so that if you take away the freedoms that head teachers have and that school leaders have and that teachers have, we're going to have a larger problem when it comes to recruitment and retention. So the things that she should be doing to help, she's not. And then she's actually ruining things in other ways to make the problems even greater. I feel like she doesn't really know, and that she would do well, I think, to visit schools like Michaela. But if she doesn't want to visit us, because she obviously, I don't know, I suppose she doesn't like us very much. That's why she didn't want to congratulate us. That's okay. There are other schools. There are, some 90-odd schools that performed very well in terms of their progress 8, above 1.5. I think she should visit a number of those schools, and then she'll find that they all have quite a lot in common with regard to offering a traditional education, having excellent discipline systems, and being able to use the freedoms that they've got to give that bespoke, tailored education to their children.
Now, of course, one of the foundations of that education is the curriculum itself. And you've already mentioned the fact that those freedoms will disappear. But there is also a review of that national curriculum underway by Professor Becky Francis. At the moment, the curriculum's not perfect, but at least it is broadly based on evidence and with some kind of traditional canon of literature in there. Are you worried that that will change? What are your fears about this curriculum review?
Yeah, well, I have fears because Professor Becky Francis, her leanings are quite clear in terms of what she believes in. And I do believe that a traditional education is what helps the poor. It enables social mobility for the poor and gives poor children a chance to compete with the boys at Eton. And I would hate the idea that we would change the curriculum in such a way so that we would take away the great movement forward that we've had with social mobility. We at Michaela have demonstrated that, and so many other schools have showed that, and they have done so through a traditional manner, which I worry Professor Becky Francis will not adhere to. I can't say because obviously the review has not yet been done, but I do worry that will change and that this will harm poor children in particular.
Catherine Birbalsingh, thank you so much for joining me. So that was Catherine Birbalsingh, head teacher of the very successful Michaela School. Now, Bill, I'll come to you first. The Conservative government did a lot of things wrong, but one of the things it did right was these educational reforms that pushed Britain's children up, well, I should say England's children, actually, because it's not the same in England, in Scotland and Wales. England's children up the international rankings in English and maths. Why are the Labour government seeking to undo those positive reforms?
I don't think the government is, but I will give credit. I mean, I think the Tories got an awful lot wrong and also got things wrong within education. But I actually think the big change was the focus on phonics, and that did contribute to driving up standards. I also pay tribute to Catherine. She's a very successful head teacher. But she is someone, she's at pains in her letter to Bridget Phillipson to say, I didn't vote Tory at the last general election. But since she first spoke at Tory party conference in 2010, she's become something of a cheerleader for Conservative educational policy. And I think she likes...
I would say she's a cheerleader for small c Conservative education, not necessarily...
Well, I think it goes with the Conservative education policy. And I think, if I'm honest, I think she's become attracted to the profile. And some of the things she says in the letter, like she accuses Bridget Phillipson of being a Marxist. I mean, you know, that doesn't really set a good example of public debate to her students. Let's come to the substance of this. She's really angry about the fact that the government has removed the money for the teaching of Latin within schools. Only 2.7% of state schools teach Latin.
Her objection was to do it mid-year, which seems unnecessarily cruel.
But what the government has done mid-year is have a budget that has boosted per pupil spending for the first time in years, boosted capital spending and significantly enhanced special educational needs spending. Her criticism on school uniforms, and I'm someone who agrees with school uniforms, I think they help with discipline and standards. But what the government is doing is simply saying, at a time of a cost of living crisis, there should be a cap of the number of branded items at 3 that you can have in a school uniform policy. I think most parents would agree with that. And I think on that, Catherine is at odds with the mainstream.
OK. Ben, what do you think? I mean, doesn't this exemplify the deep philosophical divide between the left and the right? The left basically want to control education for good or ill. The right are more interested in having a more diverse mix of not just competition, but able to tailor education to different schools.
Diversity of thought, I think, is what the right would like. And one of the things I don't think we've mentioned is that you know, they want all teachers to be formally educated as well, trained to be teachers. And I think that is a really massive regressive step, because if you for one, you know, using a prejudicial term perhaps, but if you brainwash the teachers, it's that much easier to brainwash the pupils. And there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that successive Labour governments have sought the they've used this educational system as a means to promote their ideology. So even though we've made great strides in the last 14 years under the Conservative government in terms of improvement in mathematics, what we haven't done well at school is to roll back the impregnation of school with that kind of ideology. So critical race theory is taught as if it's a fact. Climate change is taught as if it's a settled fact. Our history, I was campaigning in Wellingborough where I stood in the general election. I went to see the sixth form politics class in Wellingborough School, and 67% of the hands went up, 2/3 of the hands went up, when I asked whether they thought that the United Kingdom's wealth was derived from the slave trade. And so our schools have already been significantly hijacked by, I think, ideological aims, driven, I think, mainly by the Labour government, who seem to have an antipathy. Labour seems to have an antipathy to this country, which I find quite bizarre. I know you're shaking your head, Bill, but it is true. Every bit of evidence I look at suggests to me that actually Labour supporters and voters and the government, not so much the voters, but the government stand in opposition to the United Kingdom. Starmer, I think, is anti-British. And this long march through the institutions goes through the schools, goes through the universities, and, you know, we could talk about it for a long time.
Well, yeah, I think 9% of young women think Churchill was a good figure in history. 9%.
Yeah,
and the difference between that and so, of course, Conservatives have to.
But let's come back to the substance of this. The Labour Party, since its creation, has passionately believed in the power of education and aspiration to enhance the lives of young people. Not indoctrination. Look, I really disagree with your notion, Miriam, that the Labour Party is in favour of control and the Tory Party isn't. You know, who brought in the national curriculum originally? A Tory government. Look at the record of Michael Gove in imposing in detailed terms the kind of history that can be taught within the classroom. But he had to roll back a lot of the damage done by previous Labour administrations. That's what Michael Gove was trying to achieve.
I think there's a difference between setting a kind of minimum standard for the curriculum and then the kind of micromanagement that this bill will bring in. So, for example, one of the provisions of this bill is that the Education Secretary herself or himself, whatever ends up being, can actually direct academy leaders on any matter of their choosing, which seems like an extraordinary clawback. But I want to go back to this, your criticism of Catherine Birbalsingh calling Bridget Phillipson a Marxist. Now, maybe that's a bit strong. Maybe that's
well, it's not true. It's not true. It's abuse.
OK, well, we can debate that. But I suppose the theory is that if you are teaching children a historically accurate curriculum and one that teaches them common facts about our history, not lies about our history, but common facts about our history, then you are going to carry on what we would call British culture. If you teach only what's relevant now, which is what Labour seem to want to do, you can guarantee that that will be irrelevant in 20 years' time.
Well, I have to declare an interest. I'm the Chief Executive of Parallel Histories that resources schools in the teaching of contested history. And our approach is very much that school students need to be immersed in both sides of the sources, both sides of the argument in terms of contested history. And that's fantastic in developing their critical thinking skills, their oracy skills and their civic contribution. So I think it's very simplistic to say there's just one version of history and all you need to do is by rote learn the facts and the figures. I think people need to understand history, they need to grapple with it, and that's part of the educational process. But hold on, let's come back to academies. I'll declare another interest. I'm a board member of an academies trust, and I think they do very good work. And to my own party, I would say, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think once this bill goes through the committee stage and amendments start being made, I think some of those restrictions on academies will be removed.
Very quick final word.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, digressing slightly, but non-crime hate incidents, for example, have been levied against children at school, and
which I wholly oppose, and the government does.
Yeah, but what it attests to is an attempt by the authorities to indoctrinate. I mean, the whole point about being at school, in my mind, is to say offensive things, to be offended, have robust debate.
Totally agree.
Have really robust debate, and then settle your own views through that robust debate. Not have a policeman tap you on the shoulder and say, actually, what you're saying is
And
hateful.
no one in Parliament, on
Yeah.
either side of the political spectrum, envisaged police operating in the way that they are
We're going to have to leave it there,
regard to
but
non-hate
I
crimes.
believe in critical thinking, but you've got to be taught the truth first, and that is the point of making sure that children are taught the right things. Well, coming up after the break, as the NHS enters another winter crisis, we're going to be asking why the UK has so few hospital beds and what can we do about it.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Ironic article in The Guardian, Nick, caring about facts.
Yeah, this is Meta is ushering in a world without facts, says Nobel Peace Prize winner. And they just seem to give these Nobel Peace Prizes to anyone these days. It's Maria Ressa.
Not working.
Zuckerberg came out, and it was very bold. He said a few things. We're going to use community notes instead of fact-checkers. Fact-checkers in inverted commas, because it just means people pushing usually a specific viewpoint. Community notes seems to be a great system that X uses, so why not do that? I think that's great. He's going to reduce restrictions on topics like immigration and gender. Good, because I'm against censorship. He's going to push back on governments around the world that are going after American companies and pushing to censor more, which is great. He's also moving content moderation to Texas instead of California, which is banter. So now the cynical version is he just realises we've got a new regime, it's the MAGA era, and I want to be mates with Trump, who said that I should that if I interfere with the 2024 election, he should spend the rest of his life in prison. So he did mention he might be a bit scared of that. He was involved in that in Facebook suppressing the Hunter Biden laptop scandal, and I feel that he didn't like being a part of all that from watching interviews.
And also the suppression of arguments about gender and, sex, what is biological sex and whatnot. You get banned for saying there are two sexes.
They're on the wrong side of this, and now he's correcting. But the weird thing is the people, of course, the people who don't like this, the lefties, this person, Ressa, is saying that this is a big problem. That it's an extremely dangerous time. I've seen all this from the lefties. They just call it disinformation. They're worried about this because to them it's disinformation. To other people it's information.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think we can all agree if people think they're getting their facts just directly from Facebook, then something's horribly wrong. But we know that. The community notes thing, I think, is quite good because that sort of first-hand experience people are putting down, aren't they?
Yeah. People have loads of different views come together, and it's an aggregate, so that's why it works.
GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. This is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel. And as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Headliners on GB News 11 p.m. every night. It's got 3 top comedians going through the next day's newspapers so you don't have to read them, which is great.
That's a good point. He's lying. Maybe he's not lying.
That's Headliners every night from 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. as well on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Bev Turner. Thank you for joining us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Dewbs & Co with me, Miriam Cates, and keeping me company until 7 o'clock, I've got former Labour Armed Forces Minister Bill Rammell and former Deputy Leader of Reform Ben Habib. Now, you've already been getting in touch with your views and comments on our debate so far. Rod says Catherine, that's Catherine Birbalsingh, is needed to run the education department in this country. I would love to see that. I think half the education department wouldn't be needed anymore. And another Catherine says, with all due respect to Catherine, I believe there's a lot wrong with our education system for many children. The Conservatives nor any other political party have provided the type of education that would benefit all children. Why do you think there's such a problem in the profession with recruitment and retainment? A very good question. Maybe we should cover that on our next show because I think it's a really good discussion. Well, moving on. This week, the Royal College of Nursing has published a devastating report which reveals how patients are routinely being treated in unsafe conditions in British hospitals. The document detailed cases of people dying alone in corridors, women miscarrying in public, and immobile patients being forced to use bedpans with no privacy. And today it was reported that 1 in 7 NHS hospital beds is being taken up by patients who are well enough to be discharged, but for whom there is no social care available. Now, every winter seems to bring another one of these bed-blocking crises. So is it any wonder that people are being treated on corridors when Britain has so few hospital beds available compared to other countries? So if you take a look at the figures, the UK has 2.3 hospital beds per 1,000 people. I think we have something like 160,000 hospital beds. But compare that to France, who have 5.7 hospital beds, more than double, and 7.8 hospital beds per 1,000 in Germany, treble. So how do we get out of this cycle of decline when we have just so few beds compared to similar countries? Ben, bringing you in first, I was really shocked when I saw those statistics. I know that the NHS is underperforming compared to comparable healthcare systems in other countries, but those stark statistics really reveal why we are in this state of permacrisis.
It is, and I mean, it's not, the NHS is not alone in its collapse, is it? All our public services seem to be either non-functioning or completely functionless. Sorry, that's probably a bit harsh, but you know what I'm saying. And I think that's what it is. We've got an economy that is seriously challenged by the form of governance that we've been experiencing for the last 27 years, which is basically borrow, tax and spend. Greater interference by government in everything that we do in the economic ecosystem. And ultimately that leads to no growth, which is what we've now got. Growth per capita reducing because we've obviously got lots of people coming to the country. And of course that burdens the NHS as well. We've just got a complete breakdown in public sector services. Of course, the NHS has the added problem of ever better treatments, ever more expensive treatments, a failure of the social services, as you indicated, taking the elderly out of beds when they shouldn't be in hospitals, hospitals being used as a place to park people as opposed to treat them. So you've got a massive number of different issues all coming together, I think, to nobble the NHS. And I'll just say one statistic, which you didn't mention, which I think is remarkable, is that it's a constitutional aim of the NHS to treat people, 92% of people within 18 weeks of them being registered. And there are more than 3 million people in the UK that breach that constitutional aim. Yeah. It's a disaster.
Yeah. And one of the reasons for this is funding. And, of course, I'm not going to put words into Ben's mouth, but people on the right often say we're just pouring more and more money into the NHS, which is true, but we still spend far less per capita on health in this country than other countries where they have a mixed system, where they have some private funding as well.
Well, let's go back to the 18-week figure. We achieved 18-week maximum waiting times when Labour was last in office. It's risen dramatically during the 14 years. It has,
but we've also got 3.5 million more over 65 since then, which is a big factor that all countries are facing.
With investment and reform, you can make a difference. And you know, the budget announcement, and there was lots of criticism about some taxes going up on businesses. Actually, it delivered 22 billion extra for the National Health Service, the best settlement since 2010, but also reform, greater use of the private sector, surgical treatment hubs within the community. Coming back to the figure of beds, the reason we've got such a small number of beds is there has been a settled consensus within the National Health Service for over a generation that it's not the number of beds that you have, but it's their efficiency. However, I'm really struck by the contrast with Europe. I mean, you know, 160,000 NHS beds in the UK, 229,000 in France. Yeah. I think that needs to be looked at. But one other thing that troubles me about this and I say this gently, this government is rightly committed to prioritising relatively primary care in the community. I think, and you know, this was from the figures were from the Royal College of Nursing. I think there's a lobbying job going on to relatively protect hospitals as opposed to the primary care system, and I don't think that's in the patient interest.
Yes, but you could prevent people from going to hospitals in the first place.
Absolutely.
You have
that would be the best bang for your buck.
Coming back to the funding, you've mentioned the government has poured more money into NHS. I personally think Wes Streeting is one of the ablest ministers they've got, and you know, I support what he's trying to do. But again, looking at the funding, I think in the UK, we spend about $5,000 per capita on health. Germany is $8,000. We are 18 18th in the list of countries. And isn't the problem that even if you can scrape a few more billions off the taxpayer, if it's only the taxpayer that's going to fund the NHS, we are never going to achieve that level of funding. Isn't it time for some form of insurance model or privatisation on top of taxpayer contributions?
Well, Miriam, I respect your view, but that's not where the vast bulk of the British people are. Rightly or wrongly, rightly in my view, they are attached to the NHS system where, you know, you pay through general taxation and then it's free at the point of use. I think that's... You look at the polling evidence, overwhelmingly people back that model.
But it's not working, though, Bill, is it?
Well, no, it's not working. But Miriam quoted the funding disparity. Go back to 2010, and the funding disparity was nothing like that for the National Health Service.
10% of the British government goes on the NHS.
10%?
10% of the budget public spending goes on the NHS, 200 billion or so. In the US, it's 17%. It's massive.
But the US is a really odd example because they also have some of the worst outcomes.
But they have a pay-and-play system as well. You know, it's only the elderly who get it completely free.
And they had, until relatively recently, they had a system where people turned up at hospital and were turned away.
But the US system is uniquely awful. It's terribly expensive and with very poor outcomes. But there are other models. The French, the German, the Israelis all have this mixed economy where the state pays some of the money, there is some private insurance, there's a little bit of competition between hospitals, and people have the sense that actually there's some value in this. You have to pay €10 to see a GP, for example. Not a lot of money, but it makes you realise how much it's valuable.
And why not give people tax relief on buying private medical insurance? Why not do that? Incentivise people themselves to take the burden off the NHS.
But look, when you start talking about charging, and I can objectively see, for example, when people don't turn up for a GP appointment, objectively, there should be a charge. I'll tell you what, the government that brings in a charge from that is going to face a howl of outrage from the public.
But I think that the problem is the NHS has served us really, really well for 50 years. But when the NHS was born, life expectancy was 65, and the only treatments on offer were for kind of short illnesses, emergency treatment. Fine, but you can socialise the cost of that. But now we've got an ageing society, obviously. The NHS has been successful. Amazing high-tech treatments available and an ageing population. And if we're ever going to achieve if we were to achieve a German level of funding for our healthcare system, that would be £150 billion extra a year. That's the whole of the state pension. It's never going to happen. If we want French and German style healthcare, we're going to have to pay for it with some other funding.
Well, look, I keep, and I would as a former minister in the last Labour government, I keep harking back to 2010, but we had waiting lists, maximum 18 weeks, and satisfaction levels with the NHS at an all-time high. It's what's happened since then that has created so many problems. Now, it's not going to be put right overnight, and, you know, there was a very good budget settlement this year for the National Health Service. We're going to need more of those moving forward, and I think you can begin to make a difference. But this is probably a 10-year job to repair and rebuild the National Health Service. I think in 5 years we'll make significant progress.
Bill, it does need re-engineering. We need a new approach to the NHS because, as Miriam says, life expectancy has gone from 65 years to 81 years. Population has grown dramatically. The kinds of treatments available are much more expensive than they used to be. How can the NHS cope? But
part of the solution, and it does need new thinking, is that shift from hospitals to the primary
I think that's absolutely right.
And I said it. What worries me about this, I think there's a lobbying job going on. Both the unions and the professionals know that there's a big injection of cash coming in, and they're trying to fight for it for hospitals. And I don't think that's necessarily in all our interests.
Very interesting. Well, let us know what you think on gbnews.com/your say. Coming up, Jimmy Mizen's killer has been recalled to prison after releasing a rap video that glorified the murder. We'll be asking, is drill music fueling violence and gang culture among young people in Britain? Don't go away.
Good evening. It's time for your latest Met Office weather forecast for GB News. Now, as we go through this coming weekend, it is going to be pretty chilly, despite the fact that there may be a bit more sunshine on offer than we've had through today, at least. Still heavily under the influence of high pressure, this clinging on for quite a while, but eventually, as we go through this weekend, a front will push in. But for the time being, any frontal systems staying to the northwest, so the wet weather across northwest Scotland through today, that clears away this evening, so a largely dry picture overnight. tonight. A lot of cloud though, clear breaks really confined to just northern parts of Scotland and a few breaks elsewhere. Where we get the clear breaks, temperatures will drop a touch of frost. Even under the cloud though, it is going to be a cold and perhaps even frosty start first thing tomorrow morning. Like I said, the greatest breaks overnight will be across northern parts of Scotland. So here a bright start, but a chilly one for some places here. Further south, it is looking largely cloudy, limited breaks in the cloud overnight and first thing tomorrow morning. So not a huge amount of sunshine. And across much of England and Wales, a lot of cloud, and that cloud is going to be quite thick. So there will be some spots of drizzly rain around. And with temperatures in some places close to or a little bit below freezing, that drizzly rain could actually come in the form of snow grains instead in some places. But as we go into the afternoon, a greater chance of seeing some sunny skies, especially across parts of northern England, Wales, the southwest, and also northern parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland too. That being said, temperatures are likely to be a little bit lower than today. And in the south, it's going to be pretty chilly, and even further north, only around average for the time of year. After a potentially foggy and frosty start on Sunday, it is going to be a similar day to Saturday, really, for many places. Some sunshine, but a bit of rain starting to push its way in from the west, although this doesn't look especially heavy. Staying largely cloudy as we go through the outlook period into the beginning of next week, and temperatures a little bit on the low side. Bye-bye.
The latest GB News travel.
Good evening, I'm Johnny Ratner. Big problems up in Aberdeenshire to the southwest of Peterhead. The A90 stays closed along Haven. A serious accident continues to be investigated. You're being diverted onto the A952 and the A950. On Merseyside at Wallasey, the A5139, the Wallasey Donk Link North, that's still closed for a police investigation. And the M1 in Bedfordshire, partly blocked southbound from junction 13 to 12 just south of Bedford, following an accident involving a couple of lorries. On the Surrey stretch of the M25, the inside lane's closed clockwise. Recovery works underway just after 6 at Godstone, and further round on the top stretch in Hertfordshire, there are queues clockwise towards the roadworks at the A1M. Finally, in East Sussex to the northwest of Heathfield at 5 Ashes, the A267 is closed on Wellbrook Hill. A car and a van collided at Hawley Green Road, left spillage and debris all over the road. That's the latest.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Welcome back to Dewbs & Co with me, Miriam Cates, and keeping me company until 7 o'clock, I've got former Labour Armed Forces Minister Bill Rammell and former Deputy Leader of Reform Ben Habib. And we've got a few views come in from you at home. Diane says, Rammell is right for once. There you go, Bill. The NHS needs reform. It doesn't need more investment. It needs root and branch reform. And
I think I said both.
Yes, I think Bill says we need both, but we'll take that as a win, Bill. Jane says we have less hospital beds because we shut a load of hospitals down and made us all travel out of town. That is true, actually. The number of hospital beds in England has declined quite a lot over the last few years. Now, moving on to a really, really tragic story. You may remember Jake Fahey was jailed for life in 2009 after killing schoolboy Jimmy Mizzen by throwing a large glass dish that shattered and severed an artery in his neck. Now, Jake was released in June 2023 after serving his time, and he's believed to be the 35-year-old drill rapper known as 10. He's particularly known for his violent lyrics and hiding his identity behind a balaclava. Now, I'm going to read out some of those lyrics, but with a warning that some of the lines may be very disturbing to some viewers. So they go, sharpen up my blade, I've got to keep those necessary. Stay alert and keep it ready, any corner could be deadly. Stuck it on a man and watched him melt like Ben and Jerry's. Now, the Ministry of Justice is investigating Fahey for the lyrics referencing the murder. And yesterday he was arrested and recalled by police for breaking his parole. He'll now spend at least another year behind bars. But is this case yet another example of the violence infecting some aspects of youth culture, particularly in this case through music? Now, Bill, obviously there was a particular circumstance that this music breached his parole conditions, but there is a broader question. Should we be playing music, should the BBC be playing music that so clearly does glorify violence?
Just factually, I don't think it was the music that breached his bail conditions. I think it was appearing in Greenwich, which was part of what he wasn't supposed to do.
Oh, I see.
But it's a shocking case. Celebrating the murder of a 16-year-old boy who was totally innocent is disgusting. There are questions about this music. I mean, look, you know, I'm not a follower of rap music, but you know, there are a lot of violent references within rap music, and I think that is a concern. I think there's also a concern that the BBC was playing this guy, but there's a slippery slope. I think the BBC was wrong to play this music, but where do you draw the line? You know, do we go back to the days of Mary Whitehouse dictating what's on the radio and the television? I don't think that would necessarily be a positive step. So it is difficult to handle. But I think the other thing that comes out of this case is rehabilitation within the prison system, which is not working. You know, 46% of offenders come out and then commit crimes again within a year. There needs to be a really strong focus on rehabilitation, much better prison education to try and tackle some of these problems.
Ben, when it comes to music like this, is this just another example of one generation being shocked at what the next generation is listening to, or is there something more serious
I mean,
than that?
Often think that about myself, and not just music, in all sorts of things, you know, because I've got views that are genuinely conservative. But I don't think there's anything to be added to the cultural or social fabric of the United Kingdom with that kind of song. I just can't see any benefit to anyone. And I think he also puts a balaclava on and hides his face, you know, which is why we can't identify him exactly with the music. But I think he's a repugnant human being. Yeah. I don't think he has any place in civilized society. He went to jail at the age of 19 for killing, as you say, a 16-year-old boy, chucking a plate at him. Released 14 years later, and 16 years later, 14, 15 years later. I don't think it's about rehabilitation when it comes to this individual. I think this individual is just a violent thug, and he has no contribution to make. And frankly, I mean, I don't know what you do with people like that, but I certainly wouldn't be releasing them early from prison.
And there does seem to be more to this drill music than just, you know, so-called artistic contribution, whether you can call it that or not. There does seem some evidence that some of this music is specific to particular gangs, even within London, and it's actually used as a recruiting tool to get children involved. I mean, how do the authorities police this? Yes, of course we have free speech, but we also have public decency. You know, who makes those judgments, and where do we draw the line?
That's the problem, Miriam. I think this is really difficult to legislate against. Where you have particular examples like this of a guy celebrating the murder of a 16-year-old that he killed, then I think there can be an intervention. But, you know, once you start policing the lyrics within songs, you know, that's a different kind of society to the one we're used to.
Because the BBC had already, I don't know what the technical term is, but bleeped out some of the more offensive.
So they had listened.
They'd already recognised the fact that this wasn't really suitable listening. But it is, you know, I think this is a really important debate, because on the one hand, you know, some Liberals will say, well, what does it matter what you listen to? It doesn't affect your behaviour, you know.
But it does.
But it does.
Of course it does.
Language is everything.
Language is everything. And it was an interesting choice of words you used, which I endorse completely, that you can't legislate against this. And what it attests to, again, is another form of our broken society, where we have a culture which is tolerant of this kind of nonsense. You know, it should be his community, his family, his friends, his relations who should be saying to him, for goodness sake, zip it.
And executive of the BBC saying, just, this is indecent. Not, you know, not this shouldn't be allowed or whatever, but just as in, what does this add? But, yeah, I agree, it is really, really difficult. But it does feed in very much to this sub-youth culture now that in some parts, particularly of London, is really glorifying violence and knives and things like that. It must be having an impact.
I think that's true, but we should never forget that it is still a very small minority. The vast majority of kids in this country are lawful. They work hard at school. You know, they're not involved in violence and crime. And we need to get that perspective.
Absolutely. But where are they getting their influence from? And that is something we're going to be talking about in the final section of our show, because coming up, we're asking, should the UK follow America's lead and ban TikTok? The app's due to be made illegal from Sunday, unless there's any last-minute change of plan. That's coming up after the break.
Ready to soak up that holiday sunshine?
Won't we need some cover?
No worries. All sorted.
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations Forecast.
If you or someone you know is looking for winter sun over the next few days, it will be breezy across much of the Med with some wet weather for Italy, but a lot of fine weather for Portugal and Spain, at least on Saturday. We're going to see sunny skies, a few drops of rain there for Gibraltar, but this system, named Storm Gabri by the Italians, is going to bring some very wet and windy weather through Sardinia, Sicily and much of Italy. That moves away through next week and it turns more unsettled in Spain.
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations Forecast.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Lisa, you got in touch with me and you flagged this survey because you were concerned as a parent that your child had been given this to fill out.
Yeah, I mean, my daughter came home from school. She was very confused. She was asking why somebody would want to hurt themselves if they were feeling sad or worried about something. So that led to a conversation that we had, and I actually phoned the school and asked them to send me the survey, which with a lot of pushing, they eventually did send me the survey. And when I read through it, I was just completely shocked at the content. The survey says when I'm feeling worried that maybe I should try cutting or harming myself, because it's in the survey, so that must be an option. I've tried everything else, so why not try this?
It is astonishing that some of these are young children who are perhaps being introduced to these, these abuses for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a list of 17 different types of drugs, some of which I've actually never heard of myself. I mean, the wording on here is, have you ever got high from taking drugs? I mean...
And we know that some of these behaviours, self-harm, gender dysphoria, taking drugs, are psychologically contagious. Children do them because they see other children do them, or they find out about them from the internet or from surveys like this. So the idea that this is just information gathering and won't go any further than that is ridiculous. There was a similar survey in Scotland, I think, about 3 years ago, where children the same age, 11, 12, 13, were asked about their sex lives. How many times have you had sex in the last year? How did you have sex? Did you use contraception? Totally normalising underage sex. So the idea that children are just mini adults and we can confront them with all the same kind of ideas and dilemmas that adults have to face is just ridiculous.
GB News, the People's Channel.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently. It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it? It's explosive. I mean, this is very good. It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Mornings don't have to be tiresome, especially if you have the right company.
Wake up to news as it happens, opinion and debate, and of course, a little bit of entertainment too.
Because when the kettle's on, we're on.
That's Breakfast on GB News, a show worth waking up for.
Every morning from 6 a.m.
Only on the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We'll spread the news, you spread the word.
Welcome back to Dewbs & Co, and I'm still joined by former Labour Armed Forces Minister Bill Rammell and former Deputy Leader of Reform Ben Habib. And a quick look at some of your comments. We were talking about drill music in the last section. Philip says, companies such as Spotify have a responsibility to stop these rappers' monetisation, the same way that YouTube stops monetisation when certain safety rules are broken. Why fund these juveniles? Very good point. Well, we're staying on the kind of social media theme, and we're now going to look at a new US law which is going to ban TikTok in the USA, and it will come into force on Sunday. Now, the law was signed off by President Biden last year, and it sees Congress requiring ByteDance, that's TikTok's Chinese parent company, to sell TikTok on national security grounds or face the ban. So what might actually happen on Sunday? Well, firstly, access, if you're in the US, to TikTok will be limited. TikTok will be removed from the app stores. New downloads and updates will be blocked. However, there are some workarounds exist and instructions are circulating online. Users could bypass the bans using VPNs or sideloading, that this is risky and potentially illegal. Competitors might also gain, so platforms like Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts could also attract new users and advertisers. And finally, the app's Chinese owner, ByteDance, might reconsider selling if the new ban really does harm their platform. So what do you think? Is this the right decision for national security, or does a ban impede on freedom of speech and expression? Now, Bill, I'm going to have to ask you, do you use TikTok?
No, I've only just learned to use my iPhone. So.
OK, well, very good. So we thought we'd put together a little compilation of what you can see on TikTok. It's not exactly high culture. These are some of the more family-friendly videos that we find. Take a look. Don't wanna make it
Suspect looks like squeezed toothpaste. Really? What? Squeeze at the top? Suspect looks like melting plastic.
I mean, there are some funny and cute videos on there, but, I mean, you know, is it a national security risk? Does this deserve a ban?
Well, I think we should be very, very careful of anything Chinese. I know ByteDance is ostensibly a private company, but as we were discussing earlier, it is, and there's no such thing as a private company in China. And we should be very, very suspicious of anything Chinese, and I completely support the Supreme Court banning it in the US. And again, rather like, it's not quite as bad as Farry, but I don't think TikTok really adds much to the social or cultural fabric of the United Kingdom. It won't be lost. I don't think it's a freedom of speech issue. There are many other channels through which freedom of speech can be channeled. This is not shutting down freedom of speech. And if TikTok wants to continue its service in the US, it should sell its business.
Bill, do you think this ban will actually work?
No, I don't, and I'll come to that. But, I mean, the reason they've passed the legislation is because there's a concern about the harvesting of data and that being passed to the Chinese government. Now, the Chinese are nefarious actors, in my view. I've got some personal experience as a former Foreign Office Minister where going in to meet the Chinese Foreign Secretary, my briefing pack was stolen. I'm not going to go into... stolen by the Chinese. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but we know it was stolen by Chinese officials. So that's what they do on a small scale. They do it on a large scale. However, I'm really not convinced that this will work. I mean, Biden said that he won't enact it before he leaves office. Trump has made it very clear that he's opposed to it. And already a whole host of people are gravitating to what's called Red Note, which is another Chinese-owned platform. So I think it's really difficult to tackle. What I think we genuinely need, however, is regulation, and you're going to have to have international agreement about this, of all social media platforms, because, you know, what we say here today is regulated by Ofcom.
Yeah, but I think
there's no regulation.
Yeah,
in
but I
social
think
media.
that is dumbing down free speech, and frankly, I think Ofcom dumbs down free speech. I don't agree with that. That's a much bigger step than outlawing TikTok. Much bigger step.
I think we need to separate the two arguments. There is obviously a free speech argument, which is to do with being able to have free exchange of ideas and to say whatever you think and not to be faced with violence or threat or undue discrimination. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about is an entirely new medium that has completely disrupted the way we speak, the way we communicate. And of course, there are some good things about that, but there are also some very real risks. And one of the problems with TikTok and social media is it allows external influences into the bedrooms of our children. And all societies in history have carefully controlled what influences your kids. How else do you make sure that children grow up knowing right from wrong, being loyal to their family, community and nation, being good employees, good spouses, good parents? The only way you do it is control what influences your children. We've lost control.
And there is research evidence that TikTok is addictive in the way that it works, and, you know, it encourages young people to get more and more engaged in the process. So I think there are real concerns.
All social media tries to do that.
Yeah.
You know, nowadays, even on X, if you watch a video, you finish watching what you wanted to watch, and then it shows you something else. And LinkedIn does the same thing. So they're all trying to capture you and hold you there. But, I mean, I think TikTok, you're absolutely right. You know, if you're prone to ADHD in any sense, I mean, TikTok must be an utter disaster for you because, you know, it's just constantly bashing at your brain.
Well, it's interesting that figures for ADHD and behavioural issues have increased so much over the years.
Yeah, well, there you go.
It became ubiquitous, so there's got to be a link.
Yeah, and we should be very, very controlling of what our young see. That is not a freedom of speech issue either. You know, until they're of age, there should be controls, and we have lost sight of it. And, you know, we've handed over to the state in many respects, or we've just abrogated our responsibility altogether as parents. And that unit needs to be brought back. But
We're ending on a degree of agreement.
We've been in agreement on quite a lot.
I think there's a whole host of benefits from technology,
yeah,
but there are some real downsides as well. And I think young people are growing up with technology on their phones, doing that constantly instead of, you go back to the National Health Service argument, instead of being out on the playing field and exercising. And I think that is a genuine concern. And it's not an unadulterated good for young people to have access to technology in the way that they do.
Can I just quick on? My mother used to confiscate my comics because she thought I spent too much time in my bedroom reading comics.
My goodness, so Mary Whitehouse lives on. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Thank you both, my panel. Thanks for watching. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
We'll see a cold snap, which will quickly develop into a warm front. Boxed Boiler Repairs, sponsors of Weather.